courthouse was packed with people that Tuesday morning. Lawyers shuffled papers, families whispered nervously, and the judge's gavel echoed through the large room. Sarah Chen sat in the third row, holding her 3-year-old daughter Emma tightly on her lap. This wasn't supposed to happen. Sarah never imagined she would be in court fighting for custody of her own child. Emma's father had left them 2 years ago, disappearing without a trace. Sarah worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, cleaning offices at night and working at a grocery store during the day. She barely slept, but she did everything to give Emma a good life. Then out of nowhere, Emma's father returned with a team of expensive lawyers claiming Sarah was unfit to raise their daughter. The courtroom felt cold and unwelcoming. Emma fidgeted in her mother's arms, her big brown eyes taking in all the strange faces around them. She wore her favorite yellow dress with tiny flowers on it, the one Sarah had bought her for her birthday last month. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to keep Emma calm. "Don't worry, baby," Sarah whispered into Emma's ear. "Mommy's here. Everything will be okay." But Sarah wasn't sure if everything would be okay. The lawyers on the other side had painted a picture of her as a struggling single mother who couldn't provide stability. They talked about her long working hours, her small apartment, and her limited income. Every word felt like a knife cutting through her heart. Emma's father, David, sat across the room in an expensive suit. He looked successful and confident, everything Sarah felt she wasn't. He had remarried a wealthy woman and now lived in a big house with a swimming pool. His lawyers argued that Emma would have better opportunities with them. The judge called for a recess and people started moving around the courtroom. Sarah noticed the royal guard standing at attention near the entrance. They were part of a ceremonial detail for a visiting dignitary who would be using the courthouse later that day. Their red uniforms and tall black hats made them stand out among everyone else. Emma had been quiet for most of the morning, but now she started to get restless. She pointed at different things in the room, asking, "What's that?" in her sweet little voice. Sarah tried to distract her with a small toy, but Emma was more interested in all the new sights around them. That's when Emma's eyes fixed on one of the royal guards. He stood perfectly still, his face serious and professional. Emma stared at him for a long moment, her little finger pointing in his direction. Sarah followed her daughter's gaze and saw what had caught Emma's attention. The guard was young, maybe in his 20s, with kind eyes despite his stern expression. There was something familiar about him, but Sarah couldn't place what it was. Emma continued to stare, and Sarah gently tried to turn her daughter's attention away. "Emma, don't point," Sarah whispered. "It's not polite." But Emma wouldn't look away. She seemed fascinated by the guard, studying his face with the intense curiosity that only a 3-year-old could have. Other people in the courtroom began to notice Emma's staring, some smiling at the cute little girl who was clearly amazed by the uniformed guard. Sarah felt embarrassed. The last thing she needed was for Emma to cause a scene in court. She was already fighting an uphill battle to prove she was a good mother. Having her daughter act up in front of the judge would only make things worse. "Emma, look at Mommy," Sarah said softly, trying to redirect her attention. The guard, meanwhile, remained perfectly still. He had been trained not to react to distractions, to maintain his professional composure no matter what happened around him. But Sarah could see his eyes briefly glance toward Emma before returning to their forward position. The courtroom was filled with tension and worry. Families were being torn apart, lives were being decided, and futures hung in the balance. Sarah felt the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. She had spent every penny she had on a lawyer, borrowed money from friends, and taken time off work she couldn't afford to lose. All for this moment, this chance to keep her daughter. Emma finally looked away from the guard and up at her mother. Her little face was serious, as if she understood something important was happening. She reached up and touched Sarah's cheek with her small hand. "Mommy sad?" Emma asked in her innocent voice. Sarah's heart broke a little more. She tried to smile for her daughter's sake. "Mommy's okay, sweetheart. Just a little worried." The judge's voice boomed across the courtroom, calling everyone back to order. Sarah adjusted Emma on her lap and took a deep breath. The next few hours would determine whether she would go home with her daughter or lose her forever to a man who had abandoned them both. As people settled back into their seats, Emma turned once more toward the royal guard. This time something different happened. The guard's eyes met Emma's, and for just a moment his professional mask slipped. There was recognition there. a spark of something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Emma opened her mouth to speak, her little voice about to break the heavy silence of the courtroom, with words that would change everything for everyone present that day. "Daddy Mike!" Emma's clear, sweet voice rang out across the silent courtroom like a bell. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. The judge looked up from his papers with surprise. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as she followed Emma's pointing finger directly at the royal guard. The man in the red uniform suddenly went pale, his composed expression cracking for the first time. "Daddy Mike," Emma called out again, this time even louder, her little arms reaching toward the guard. Sarah's mind raced. Daddy Mike? Emma had never called anyone by that name before. She looked between her daughter and the guard, confusion washing over her. The guard's eyes were wide with shock and his hands trembled slightly at his sides. The courtroom erupted in whispers. David, Emma's biological father, stood up abruptly from his seat. "What is this?" he demanded. "Who is that man?" The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court." But even he seemed confused by what was happening. Sarah stared at the guard, studying his face more carefully now. There was something familiar about his features, something that tugged at her memory. Emma was squirming in her arms, trying to get down, reaching toward the man in uniform. "Mike, Mike!" Emma kept calling, her voice filled with joy and recognition. The royal guard, Mike, stepped forward slightly, breaking protocol. His supervisor shot him a warning look, but Mike seemed unable to help himself. His eyes were locked on Emma, filled with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Your Honor." Sarah's lawyer stood up quickly. "I'm not sure what's happening here, but perhaps we should take another recess to sort this out." David's expensive lawyer was already on his feet. "This is clearly some kind of setup, Your Honor. A stage performance to manipulate the court's decision." But the judge was watching the interaction between Emma and the guard with growing interest. He had been presiding over family court for 20 years, and he had learned to recognize genuine emotion when he saw it. "Young man," the judge addressed the guard directly. "Do you know this child?" Mike's supervisor stepped forward. "Your Honor, Guard Morrison is on official duty and cannot—" "I asked him," the judge interrupted firmly. "Guard Morrison, is it? Do you know this little girl?" Mike looked at his supervisor, then at Emma, then back at the judge. His training told him to remain silent, to stick to protocol, but Emma's bright smile and outstretched arms broke down every wall he had built around his heart. "Yes, Your Honor," Mike said quietly. "I know her." The courtroom gasped. Sarah felt dizzy. Emma clapped her hands together with delight, as if her favorite person in the world had just appeared. David pushed past people in his row to get closer. "This is ridiculous. I don't know who this man is, but he has nothing to do with my daughter." "Your daughter?" Mike's voice carried across the room, stronger now. "Your daughter who you abandoned when she was 6 months old? Your daughter who cried for weeks when you left?" Sarah's heart stopped. How could this guard know about that? She had never told anyone the details of David's abandonment, especially not how Emma had cried endlessly those first few weeks. The judge leaned forward in his chair. "Guard Morrison, I think you need to explain yourself. How exactly do you know this child?" Mike looked at Emma again. She was bouncing in Sarah's arms now, saying, "Down, down. Want Daddy Mike." Over and over. Sarah was too shocked to move. "Your Honor," Mike began, his voice steadier now. "I've been watching over them for 2 years." "Watching over them?" the judge asked. "What does that mean?" Mike's supervisor tried to intervene again, but the judge held up his hand for silence. This was his courtroom, and he wanted answers. "I work security at the office building where Ms. Chen cleans at night," Mike explained. "I've been there for 3 years. I watched her bring Emma with her sometimes when she couldn't find a babysitter. I watched her work herself to exhaustion trying to provide for her daughter." Sarah's memory suddenly clicked into place. The night security guard at the office building. The one who always made sure the lights were on in the break room where Emma could sleep safely while Sarah worked. The one who left toys and coloring books on the table sometimes. The one who never said much but always had kind eyes. But that guard wore a regular uniform, not this royal ceremonial outfit. That's why she hadn't recognized him immediately. "You're the security guard," Sarah whispered, loud enough for the court to hear. Mike nodded. 3 jobs, actually. Security at night, construction during the day and ceremonial guard duty on weekends and special events. Just like Ms. Chen works multiple jobs to support Emma. Emma was getting more excited, reaching so hard toward Mike that Sarah was afraid she might fall. "Daddy Mike. Daddy Mike." David's face was red with anger. "He's not her father." "I'm her father." "Being a father is more than biology," Mike said, looking directly at David. "It's about being there when your child is scared. It's about reading bedtime stories at 2 in the morning in an office break room. It's about making sure a little girl feels safe while her mother works to keep a roof over their heads." The courtroom was completely silent except for Emma's happy chatter. Even the lawyers had stopped shuffling their papers. Everyone was listening to this unexpected testimony from a man who was supposed to be standing silently at attention. "Go on," the judge encouraged Mike. "Tell us what you've observed." Mike took a deep breath and looked around the courtroom. His supervisor was glaring at him, clearly unhappy with this break in protocol, but Mike had made his choice. Emma's welfare was more important than following rules. Every Tuesday and Thursday night for the past 2 years, Ms. Chen brought Emma to work with her, Mike began. She couldn't afford a babysitter, and she was too proud to ask for help. "I watched her set up a little bed for Emma in the break room with blankets and pillows." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. She remembered those nights, how worried she had been about bringing Emma to work, how she had tried to make sure no one noticed. "At first, I just made sure they were safe," Mike continued. "I checked on them during my rounds, made sure the building was secure. But then I started noticing things." "What kind of things?" the judge asked gently. "Emma would wake up sometimes crying because she was in a strange place. Ms. Chen would be in the middle of cleaning an office and she would drop everything to comfort her daughter. She would sing to her, rock her back to sleep, and then go back to work even though she was exhausted." Emma had finally convinced Sarah to let her down. The little girl immediately started walking toward Mike, her small feet making soft sounds on the courtroom floor. Several people smiled despite the serious nature of the proceedings. "I started leaving small things that might help," Mike said, watching Emma approach him. "A nightlight so Emma wouldn't be scared in the dark. Some children's books so Miss Chen could read to her. Little snacks in case Emma got hungry." Sarah's lawyer was furiously taking notes. This was exactly the kind of testimony that could help their case. Here was independent proof of Sarah's dedication to her daughter. "Did Ms. Chen know you were leaving these things?" the judge asked. Mike shook his head. "Not at first. I was just trying to help without interfering. But Emma started noticing me during my rounds. She would wave at me through the break room window. She started calling me Nightman because I was always there at night." Emma had reached Mike now and was tugging on his uniform pants. "Up, up," she demanded, raising her arms toward him. Mike looked at the judge, who nodded permission. Mike carefully picked up Emma, and she immediately wrapped her little arms around his neck, giving him a big hug. The entire courtroom watched this tender moment between the guard and the little girl. "When did she start calling you Daddy Mike?" Sarah asked softly. Mike's eyes grew misty. "About 6 months ago. She asked her mother why some kids had daddies and she didn't. Ms. Chen explained that her daddy had to go away, but that didn't mean she wasn't loved." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His new wife whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head angrily. "The next week, Emma asked me if I could be her daddy," Mike continued. "I told her I was just a friend, but she insisted on calling me Daddy Mike. Ms. Chen was embarrassed and tried to correct her, but Emma was determined." "And how did you feel about that?" the judge asked. Mike looked down at Emma, who was playing with the buttons on his uniform jacket. "Honored," he said simply. "I've never had children of my own. I never expected to have someone look at me the way Emma does, with complete trust and love." Sarah wiped away tears that were now flowing freely. She had no idea that Mike had been such a constant presence in their lives, that he had been watching over them and caring about them. "Your Honor," David's lawyer stood up. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the facts. My client is Emma's biological father and can provide a stable, wealthy home environment." "Sit down," the judge said sharply. "I'm not finished hearing this testimony." Mike continued his story. "I watched Ms. Chen teach Emma to count using office supplies. I watched her help Emma learn colors by pointing out different things around the building. I watched her sacrifice her own meals to make sure Emma always had enough to eat." "Did you ever see Ms. Chen neglect her daughter?" the judge asked. "Never," Mike said firmly. Every decision she made was about what was best for Emma. When Emma got sick, Ms. Chen took her to the doctor even though she couldn't afford it. When Emma needed new clothes, Ms. Chen bought them even if it meant she had to skip her own meals. Emma had found the shiny badge on Mike's uniform and was examining it with intense concentration. "Pretty," she said, touching it gently. "What about Emma's development?" the judge asked. "How would you describe her emotional state?" "She's the happiest, most well-adjusted child I've ever seen," Mike replied. "She's curious about everything, kind to everyone she meets, and completely secure in her mother's love. She never doubted for a second that she was wanted and cared for." David stood up again. "This man has no legal standing here. He's not family, he's not a social worker, he's just some security guard who got too attached to a child." Mike's expression hardened. "You're right. I'm not family, but I was there. Where were you when Emma took her first steps in that break room? Where were you when she said her first word, which was mama? Where were you when she had nightmares and needed someone to comfort her?" The courtroom was completely silent. Even David's lawyer seemed at a loss for words. "I was there," Mike said quietly. "Not because I had to be, but because I chose to be. Because Emma and her mother deserved to have someone looking out for them." Emma looked up at Mike's face and patted his cheek gently. "Love you, Daddy Mike," she said in her sweet little voice. The simple, innocent words hung in the air like a declaration that was worth more than any legal argument or financial statement. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. In all his years on the bench, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. The biological father who had abandoned his child was fighting for custody against a struggling single mother. And now a third party had emerged who clearly had a deep emotional bond with the child. "Guard Morrison," the judge said, "I need you to be very clear about something. Are you romantically involved with Miss Chen?" Mike shook his head immediately. "No, Your Honor. We've barely spoken beyond polite greetings. I respected her privacy and her independence. My relationship is with Emma." Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and something else she couldn't identify. She had wondered sometimes about the kind guard who left little gifts for Emma, but she had been too focused on survival to think about anything beyond work and caring for her daughter. "Then why?" the judge asked. "Why did you go out of your way to help a stranger and her child?" Mike was quiet for a moment, still holding Emma, who was now playing with the ceremonial cord on his uniform. "My mother raised me alone," he said finally. "My father left when I was 4. I remember how hard she worked, how tired she always was, how she tried to hide her tears from me." The courtroom listened intently. Even David had stopped fidgeting and was paying attention. "I watched my mother struggle the same way Ms. Chen struggles," Mike continued. "I wished then that someone had helped us, that someone had cared enough to make our lives a little easier. When I saw Ms. Chen and Emma, I couldn't just walk by. I had to help if I could." "And what do you think is in Emma's best interest?" the judge asked. Before Mike could answer, David jumped up again. "Your Honor, this is getting ridiculous. I'm her father. I have rights. I can give her a stable home, good schools, everything she needs." "Money isn't everything," Mike said, looking directly at David. "Emma needs love, consistency, and someone who puts her first. Ms. Chen has given her all of that." "I can give her love too," David protested. "I'm her father." "Then where have you been?" Mike's voice was calm but firm. "Emma is 3 years old. For 2/3 of her life, you've been absent. She doesn't even remember you." Emma looked between the two men, sensing the tension in the room. She leaned closer to Mike and whispered something in his ear that made him smile sadly. "What did she say?" the judge asked. Mike hesitated, then said, "She asked if the angry man is going to take her away from her mommy." Sarah's heart broke all over again. Her worst fears were coming true. Emma was starting to understand that this court proceeding might separate them. "Your Honor?" Sarah's lawyer stood up. "I'd like to call Ms. Chen to testify about her relationship with Guard Morrison and what he's meant to her family." The judge nodded. "Ms. Chen, please come forward." Sarah walked to the witness stand on shaky legs. Mike gently set Emma down and she ran to her mother, climbing up into Sarah's lap as she sat down. "Ms. Chen," the judge said kindly, "did you know about Guard Morrison's involvement in your daughter's life?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Not the extent of it, Your Honor. I knew there was a security guard who was always very kind to us. I noticed that sometimes there would be things in the break room that made our nights easier. A small lamp, some books, snacks for Emma. I assumed the cleaning company was providing them. When did you realize it was Guard Morrison? I started to suspect a few months ago, Sarah admitted. Emma would get excited when we arrived at the building looking for someone she called Daddy Mike. I thought it was an imaginary friend at first. But then I noticed how she would wave at the windows during security rounds and how the guard would always wave back. How did that make you feel? Sarah looked over at Mike, who was standing at attention again but watching her with concerned eyes. Grateful, she said honestly, and a little embarrassed. I'm proud and I don't like accepting charity. But I could see how happy Emma was, and I didn't want to take that away from her. Did Guard Morrison ever overstep boundaries or make you uncomfortable? Never, Sarah said firmly. He was always respectful and professional. He never tried to parent Emma or give me advice. He just made our lives a little brighter during a very dark time. Emma had been playing with Sarah's necklace, but now she looked up at the judge. Can I talk? She asked in her small voice. The courtroom chuckled softly. The judge smiled down at her. What would you like to say, Emma? Emma stood up on Sarah's lap so she could see over the witness stand. I want to go home with Mommy and Daddy Mike, she announced clearly. David's face went white. His lawyer was whispering frantically in his ear, but David wasn't listening. For the first time, he was really looking at his daughter, this little person he had created but never really known. Emma, the judge said gently, do you remember this man? He pointed to David. Emma looked at David for a long moment, studying his face with the same intensity she had shown Mike earlier. Then she shook her head. No, she said simply. I'm your daddy, David said, his voice cracking slightly. Your real daddy. Emma looked confused. She pointed to Mike. That's Daddy Mike. He reads me stories and gives me hugs when I'm scared. But I'm your father, David insisted, moving closer to the witness stand. I want to take care of you now. Emma shrank back against her mother, suddenly frightened by this strange man who was claiming to be her daddy. No, she said, her voice getting smaller. I want Mommy and Daddy Mike. The judge watched this interaction carefully. In his experience, children Emma's age were usually honest about their feelings. They didn't understand manipulation or lies. They simply responded to love and consistency. David's confident demeanor was cracking. Watching his biological daughter recoil from him while calling another man daddy was clearly not what he had expected. His new wife, sitting in the gallery, looked uncomfortable and kept glancing toward the exit. Your Honor, David's lawyer tried to regain control. We need to consider what's legally best for the child, not just her current emotional attachments. My client can provide financial stability, educational opportunities, and a traditional two-parent household. And what would happen to Guard Morrison in your scenario? The judge asked pointedly. David's lawyer shuffled his papers. He would have no legal standing to maintain contact with the child. Mr. Davis and his wife would make decisions about Emma's relationships based on what they feel is appropriate. Emma looked up at her mother with wide, frightened eyes. She might be only 3, but she understood enough to know that the scary man wanted to take her away from the people she loved. Mommy, Emma whispered. I don't want to go with him. Sarah's arms tightened protectively around her daughter. I know, baby. Mommy's trying to make sure that doesn't happen. The judge turned to Mike. Guard Morrison, I have an unusual question for you. If the court were to award custody to Ms. Chen, what role, if any, would you want to play in Emma's life going forward? Mike looked surprised by the question. He glanced at Sarah, then back at the judge. Whatever role Ms. Chen is comfortable with, Your Honor. I never intended to complicate their lives. I just wanted to help. But Emma clearly sees you as a father figure, the judge observed. That's not something that can be easily undone. I understand that, Mike said carefully. If Ms. Chen prefers that I step back to avoid complications, I would respect that decision, even though it would be difficult. Sarah felt a pang in her chest at those words. The thought of losing Mike's steady presence in their lives, of seeing Emma lose someone she clearly loved, was almost unbearable. Ms. Chen, the judge addressed her directly, what are your feelings about Guard Morrison's involvement in your daughter's life? Sarah took a moment to collect her thoughts. The entire courtroom was waiting for her answer, including Mike, whose expression was carefully neutral but whose eyes showed his anxiety about her response. Your Honor, Sarah began slowly, I never expected to be a single mother. When David left, I thought my world was ending. I had to learn how to be everything to Emma, Mother, father, provider, protector. I was so focused on just surviving that I didn't realize how much we both needed. Support. She looked over at Mike, who was still standing at attention but listening to every word. Guard Morrison never asked for anything from us, she continued. He never tried to replace David or insert himself into our family. He just quietly made our lives better in small ways. Emma learned that there are good people in the world who care about others without expecting anything in return. That's a valuable lesson. So you wouldn't object to his continued involvement? The judge asked. Sarah shook her head. I think Emma needs all the love and support she can get. If someone as good and decent as Mike wants to be part of her life, I would be honored to have him. Mike's professional composure finally cracked completely. His eyes filled with tears and he had to look away for a moment to compose himself. David stood up abruptly. This is insane.
You're going to let some random security guard play house with my daughter?
I have rights. Rights come with responsibilities, the judge said sternly. You abandoned your child for over 2 years. During that time, Ms. Chen built a life for Emma, and apparently Guard Morrison became part of that life. You can't simply reappear and expect everything to go back to the way you want it. But I'm her biological father, David protested. Biology is just the beginning, the judge replied. Being a parent means being present, being consistent, putting your child's needs before your own wants. From what I've heard today, Guard Morrison has been more of a father to Emma than you have. David's new wife was pulling on his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. She clearly hadn't signed up for this level of drama and complication. Your Honor, David's lawyer made one last attempt. My client is prepared to offer very generous visitation to Ms. Chen. She could see Emma on weekends and holidays. Emma looked up at the word, weekends. She had learned to recognize words that meant time off from work, time when she could spend all day with her mother. No, Emma said clearly, her little voice carrying across the quiet courtroom. I want to live with Mommy every day. The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly moved by everything he had witnessed. I'm going to call a recess, he announced. I want to speak with the attorneys in my chambers. This case has taken some unexpected turns, and I need time to consider all the factors involved. As people began to move around the courtroom, Mike approached Sarah and Emma. His supervisor tried to stop him, but Mike shook his head. Sarah, he said quietly, using her first name for the first time, I want you to know that whatever happens, you're an amazing mother. Emma is lucky to have you. Emma reached for Mike and he picked her up again. Daddy Mike, are you going to come home with us? She asked innocently. Mike looked at Sarah over Emma's head. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two people who had been through so much, who had found an unexpected connection through their love for this little girl. We'll see, sweetheart, Mike said gently. The important thing is that you stay with your mommy. And you too, Emma insisted. I want you too. Sarah felt tears starting again. Whatever the judge decided, their lives had already been changed forever by this day in court. The recess felt like it lasted forever. Sarah sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, holding Emma close while Mike sat nearby in his ceremonial uniform. His supervisor had given up trying to control the situation and was making phone calls, probably explaining to someone higher up why one of their guards had become the star witness in a custody case. Emma had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, exhausted by all the excitement and stress of the morning. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair and tried not to think about what might happen if the judge ruled against them. Sarah, Mike said quietly, not wanting to wake Emma, I need you to know something. She looked up at him, noticing for the first time how tired he looked. She wondered how many hours he worked between his 3 jobs, how much sleep he sacrificed to make ends meet, just like she did. What is it? She asked. If the judge awards you custody, and if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to help in whatever way I can, he said carefully. Not just as a friend to Emma, but I'd like to help you too. You shouldn't have to carry everything alone. Sarah felt her heart flutter. Mike, you don't have to. I want to, he interrupted gently. These past 2 years, watching you fight for Emma, watching you sacrifice everything for her happiness, I've never met anyone stronger or more dedicated. You and Emma have become the best part of my days. Before Sarah could respond, David appeared in the hallway. His wife was nowhere to be seen, and he looked defeated and confused. Can I? He started, then stopped. He looked at Emma sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. Can I talk to you for a minute? Sarah looked at Mike, who nodded encouragingly. I'll watch Emma. he offered. Sarah carefully transferred her sleeping daughter to Mike's arms, and Emma automatically snuggled against his chest without waking up. David watched this interaction with a pained expression. Sarah and David walked a few steps away, far enough to talk privately but close enough that Sarah could keep an eye on Emma. "She really doesn't remember me," David said quietly. "It wasn't a question," Sarah shook her head. "She was so young when you left. And you were only around for 6 months before that." David ran his hands through his hair. I thought it would be easy. Come back. Be the father I should have been, give her a better life than you could provide." "What changed your mind?" Sarah asked. "Watching her today," David admitted. "Seeing how afraid she was of me, how she clung to you and that guard. I thought money and a big house would be enough, but she doesn't care about any of that. She just wants to feel safe and loved." Sarah softened slightly. This was the most honest David had been since he'd returned to their lives. "She is safe and loved," Sarah said firmly. "Maybe we don't have much money, but Emma has never doubted for a second that she was wanted." David looked over at Mike, who was gently rocking Emma while she slept. "He really loves her, doesn't he?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. "And she loves him. He's been the stable male figure in her life when she needed one most." "I messed up," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was young and scared and selfish. I thought running away would solve my problems, but it just created new ones." "You can't undo the past, David," Sarah said, "but you can decide what kind of person you want to be going forward." David was quiet for a long moment. What kind of father abandons his child and then tries to take her away from the only family she's ever known? "One who realizes he made a mistake and is willing to do what's right now," Sarah replied. Just then, the bailiff announced that court was resuming. Sarah and David walked back toward Mike, who was still holding Emma. She had woken up during their conversation and was chattering quietly to Mike about something she had seen in a picture book. "Mommy," Emma reached for Sarah as they approached.
Daddy Mike was telling me about horses.
Sarah took Emma back into her arms, and they all filed back into the courtroom. The atmosphere felt different now, less adversarial and more somber. The judge took his seat and looked out over the assembled group. "This has been one of the most unusual custody cases I've presided over," the judge began. "I've heard testimony about abandonment, dedication, sacrifice, and love. I've seen a biological father who left his child, a mother who gave up everything for her daughter's welfare, and a man who had no legal obligation to this family but chose to care for them. Anyway." The courtroom was completely silent except for Emma's soft humming as she played with a small toy Mike had given her. "I've also had the opportunity to observe how the child in question responds to the various adults in her life," the judge continued. "And what I've seen is a little girl who is clearly bonded to her mother and to Guard Morrison, and who is fearful of the man who claims paternal rights but has been absent from her life." David's lawyer started to object, but David put a hand on his arm to stop him. "However," the judge said, "before I make my ruling, I understand that Mr. Davis has something he'd like to say to the court." David stood up slowly. His expensive suit looked rumpled now, and his confident demeanor from the morning was completely gone. He looked like a man who had finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost. "Your Honor," David began, his voice shaky, "I'd like to withdraw my petition for custody." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. Emma looked up at her mother's face and smiled, not understanding what was happening but sensing that something good had occurred. "Are you certain, Mr. Davis?" the judge asked. "This is not a decision you can easily reverse." David looked over at Sarah, Mike, and Emma. His daughter was now showing Mike something in her picture book, completely absorbed in their conversation, completely comfortable with this man who had been a stranger to David until today. "I'm certain, Your Honor," David said firmly. "My daughter is happy and loved where she is. I have no right to disrupt that for my own selfish reasons." The judge nodded solemnly. "Mr. Davis, withdrawing your petition means you're giving up your parental rights. Do you understand that?" David took a shaky breath. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand. But I'd like to ask for something else if the court would consider it." "What would that be?" "I'd like to request that Ms. Chen be allowed to make decisions about whether Emma ever wants to know about me," David said. "I don't want to force myself into her life, but if someday she has questions about her biological father, I'd like Sarah to be able to contact me." Sarah was surprised by this request. She looked at David and saw genuine remorse in his eyes for the first time since he'd returned. "And," David continued, "I'd like to set up a trust fund for Emma's education, not as a way to buy my way back into her life, but as the one responsibility I can still fulfill as her biological father." The judge considered this. "Ms. Chen, how do you feel about Mr. Davis's requests?" Sarah looked down at Emma, who was now coloring in a book that Mike had somehow produced from his pocket. Her daughter was completely content, surrounded by love and security. "I think that's fair," Sarah said finally. "Emma deserves to know her story when she's old enough to understand it. And the education fund, that's very generous." "Very well," the judge said. "I hereby dismiss Mr. Davis's petition for custody. Full custody remains with Ms. Chen." Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. She hugged Emma tightly and her daughter laughed with delight. "Mommy happy," Emma announced to the courtroom. But the judge wasn't finished. "There is one more matter to address," he said, looking directly at Mike. "Guard Morrison, your actions today were highly irregular. You broke protocol, left your post, and turned what should have been a simple custody hearing into something much more complicated." Mike's supervisor looked grim. It was clear that Mike was in serious trouble with his job. "However," the judge continued, "you also provided crucial testimony about the welfare of a child. You demonstrated a level of care and dedication that is rare and admirable. The court recognizes that your motivations were pure and your actions were in the best interest of the child involved." Mike remained at attention, unsure where this was leading. That said, the judge added with a slight smile, "I hope you understand that you cannot make a habit of involving yourself in court proceedings while on ceremonial duty." "Yes, Your Honor," Mike replied. "I understand completely." Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing concern. She looked up at Mike with worried eyes. "Daddy Mike in trouble?" she asked. The judge's expression softened completely. "No, sweetheart. Daddy Mike is not in trouble. He's a hero." As court was dismissed, people began filing out of the room. Sarah stood up with Emma in her arms, feeling like she was in a dream. After months of worry and fear, it was over. Emma was staying with her. Mike approached them hesitantly. "Congratulations," he said to Sarah. "I'm so happy for you both. What happens now?" Sarah asked. "With your job, I mean?" Mike shrugged. "I'll probably be reassigned to less prestigious duties. But it's worth it. Emma's safety and happiness are more important than my career." Emma reached out for Mike and he took her into his arms one more time. "Daddy Mike, will you come have dinner with us tonight?" she asked hopefully. Mike looked at Sarah, his eyebrows raised in question. Sarah smiled and nodded. "I think that sounds perfect," she said. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Sarah felt like she was seeing the world with new eyes. For so long she had been focused on just surviving, just getting through each day. But now, for the first time in years, she was thinking about the future. "Mike," she said as they reached the courthouse steps, "I have something to ask you." "What is it?" Emma's right. "We are a family, aren't we?" "The three of us?" Mike stopped walking and looked at her with surprise and hope. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel obligated because of what happened in court today." "I'm not," Sarah said firmly. "I'm saying it because it's true. You've been part of our family for 2 years already. Emma knows it, I know it, and I think you know it too." Emma clapped her hands together. "Family," she announced happily. 6 months later, Sarah and Mike were married in a small ceremony at the community center where Emma went to preschool. Emma served as the flower girl, wearing the same yellow dress she had worn to court that day. She insisted on walking down the aisle between both her parents, holding both their hands. David kept his word about the education fund and sent birthday cards twice a year, but he never asked to visit. He had found peace in knowing that Emma was loved and cared for, even if he wasn't the one providing that care. Mike left his security and construction jobs and used his military experience to become a police officer. The steady schedule and better pay meant that Sarah could cut back to one job and spend more time with Emma. Emma still called him Daddy Mike, and she told everyone who would listen about the day her daddy appeared in court, wearing a fancy red uniform to save her and her mommy. And sometimes, when Sarah watched Mike reading bedtime stories to Emma or helping her with her homework, she remembered that day in court when a 3-year-old girl had pointed at a royal guard and said 2 simple words, that changed all their lives forever. Love, Sarah had learned, didn't always come in the package you expected. Sometimes it came in the form of a quiet security guard who left toys in break rooms. Sometimes it came from the courage to fight for what mattered most. And sometimes it came from the wisdom of a child who knew exactly who belonged in her family, even when the adults were still figuring it out.